This is chapter 14 dealing with therapies. Now, this chapter is going to be probably a lot shorter than the last video on the psychological disorders because I'm really just going to be hitting the highlights of the different treatment modalities and why, how these treatments or therapies work. But before we get into individual therapies, let's talk a little bit about why people, or the reasons for why people seek therapy in the first place. I think there's a misconception out there that anybody who's going to therapy or has a therapist is doing it because they've got some kind of a psychological disorder, or they're crazy, or they're not stable. And that's kind of a misconception. Now, definitely people seek therapy because they're dealing with a psychological disorder like anxiety or depression, but that's not everybody. So I want to say maybe up to about 45% of people who actually go to therapy, they're also doing it because they're either going in looking for counseling for marriage and relational issues. You've got people who go into counseling because of grief. So they've lost a loved one or a family member and they're grieving, and so they're seeking support in that sense. Another big one is work related issues where people are struggling. So career counseling makes up a pretty good chunk of clinical psychology. And then I've also seen people who go in, they're looking to get some support with parenting help. So their children have some behavioral issues and they're looking for some parenting help. So it's not all psychological disorders. Yes, psychological disorders makes up a big chunk, but people go in because of troubled relationships, life transitions, grieving, work related issues, all of that also makes up what people go to therapy for. Now, there's really two big um, or two distinctions or two groups of therapies. There's your psychotherapies, and then there's your biomedical therapies. And psychotherapy you can kind of just think of as like the stereotypical kind of, if you think about therapy, this is what you're usually thinking of as a psychotherapy. It's where, a person's sitting on a couch or chair, and then there's a therapist there, and they're kind of interviewing them, asking them questions, really using psychological techniques to treat whatever's going on, whether that's emotional, behavioral, interpersonal problems. Um, this is what we're talking about. Psychotherapy is very theory based and oriented. So, whatever theory or perspective, psychological perspective, the therapist takes or their background is in, that's really going to determine the type of techniques and the type of treatment they're going to do. So there's, like, for example, psychoanalysis, or the behavioral perspective, or the cognitive perspective, depending on which school of thought the therapist comes from. That's going to determine the techniques that they use. That's going to determine what how therapy plays out. So that's your psychotherapy. That's what we would consider that traditional therapy. You're sitting in a room with a therapist, and they're asking you questions, trying to get a better understanding of what the individual is dealing with. On the other hand, you have biomedical therapy, and this is exactly what it sounds like. This is a more of a biological approach. It's more of a medical approach. So they're going to use medication and other medical treatments to try to treat these psychological disorders. And there's a reason why we have kind of these two treatment modalities. Some people would absolutely hate the thought of having to sit in a room with a therapist and just having this stranger ask these really intimate questions about and details about your life. And so those people would much rather just go to a doctor, get medication, and then be treated that way. On the other hand, you have people who want to stay away from medication. They don't want to take any medicine whatsoever. They would much rather just let me go deal with the therapist. Let me do it that way. I don't want to be stuck on medication for the rest of my life to deal with this. I'd much rather just do it. Trying to do it in therapy, and there's really no right or wrong answer. The generally the best form of treatment is going to be the one that works. for you or for the individual. I think there's a consensus out there though that you're going to get the best results if there's kind of a combination between the two. So combining some form of therapy with some form of medication, that's usually where you see the best results. Now, all of this therapy and treatment really started with Freud and psychoanalysis. So his theory of psychoanalysis, not only is it a perspective and a theory, but it's also a form of therapy and treatment now. And they're all the same. It's all built basically on the same focus, which is the early childhood experiences and events, and really trying to uncover some of these unconscious conflicts that stem from early childhood. So according to Freud, it doesn't matter at what point in life an individual is in. So you can be an adult or a teenager. If if you're struggling with something, whether that's a psychological disorder or some relational issues or something else like substance abuse or whatnot, according to Freud, all of that stuff stems from childhood, early childhood experiences. So whatever happened to you as a child, a lot of those events are in the unconscious and they stay there for the rest of our lives, and they basically affect our lives whether we know it or not. So a lot of it is in the unconscious. It stems from our childhood experiences. And now, so the goal of psychoanalysis, according to Freud, was always, let's bring these unconscious conflicts that are affecting your behavior. These are the things that are causing your behaviors. These are the things that are causing you distress. These are the things that cause you psychological disorders. Let's bring those unconscious conflicts up to the conscious. And then once they're there, we can kind of deal with them. We know what the root of the problem is. Now, if you're Freud and you're trying to study things that are in the unconscious, you're going to have to come up with techniques that really get into the unconscious part of the mind. And so he came up with a couple of techniques that are still used today by psychoanalysts and psychoanalytic therapists. Those are free association, dream interpretation, resistance, and transference. Now, free association, a lot of you might have heard of before. Some people play this as a game now. It's basically what free association is I'm gonna say a word, and without thinking about it too much, you just tell me the first thing that comes to your mind. And that's really what free association was. So Freud would say this list of words to his patients, and then they weren't supposed to think about it. They were just supposed to kind of respond with the first thing that comes to their mind. So if he said like work, school, home, he would just list off a bunch of words, and then the patients would just respond with whatever the first thing is that came to their mind. And basically, this was supposed to give Freud a little bit of a window into the unconscious, because you're not thinking about it. You're just responding whatever comes to your mind. That's the first thing you're saying out loud, and that would give them a little bit of an perspective on how your unconscious mind thinks. The other one is dream interpretation, which I think we've talked about a little bit when we discussed dreams early in the semester. Basically, Freud would have his clients keep journals about their dreams, or he would ask them to, just try to remember what your dream was, and then you would kind of tell Freud the story or whatever was going on in your dream, and then Freud would make the interpretation and basically tell you what your dream means. Resistance is exactly what it sounds like, and it's when the patient, especially Freud's patients, would start to become resistant to his treatment. And rather than looking at that as a bad thing, Freud actually encouraged this, and he thought of this as this was where he wanted to get to. So he wanted to get to a point where his patients would start to resist his treatment. And what we mean, or what he meant by resistance, is he would ask questions. Maybe it'd be a question that the client or the patient didn't want to answer, right? So they would, rather than giving Freud a straight answer, they would kind of dance around the topic, or they would just never get around to it. They would just be resistant, say, I don't want to talk about this right now. Or resistance, he even explained it in the sense of like clients either missing appointments or showing up late. to their appointments. He would look at that as a form of resistance, that this person is trying to resist my treatment. And rather than looking at that as a bad thing, he said this is where you want to get to as a psychoanalyst, because this means that the client is unconsciously resisting me because treatment is working, because we're getting to a point where some of these unconscious conflicts are going to start to become more conscious and we're going to become aware of. And this is actually something that the client doesn't want to become aware of, so they're being kind of resistant. They're saying, I don't want to answer that question because I'm afraid of what I'm going to find out about it. And that's kind of what resistance is. And so again, he really thought of this as, this is where you want to get to. If the client or the patient becomes resistant, it means that this treatment is working. Transference, an individual basically redirects their emotions or their feelings. Again, this is happening unconsciously. It's a redirection of emotions and feelings from one person to another. And so, what does that mean? Basically, what transference is that when you're dealing with somebody else, so let's say you're interacting with someone else and they remind you of somebody that's important in your life, or another person that's in your life, for whatever reason they remind you of that person. Whatever you feel about that person in your life, you're going to take those feelings, those emotions, those thoughts about that person, transfer them onto this new person that you're dealing with. So for example, if you were to go and see Freud at the time for treatment, and let's say Freud reminds you of your best friend. For whatever reason, there's just certain characteristics, or the way he talks or moves just reminds you of your best friend, and you really like your best friend. A lot of those positive emotions that you feel for your best friend are going to be transferred onto Freud, and so you're going to think more positively of Freud, and you're probably going to start to interact with him in a more positive sense. On the other hand, if Freud reminds you of a person that you dislike, then a lot of those emotions and those feelings are going to get transferred onto Freud as well, and you're probably going to deal with them in more of a negative light. So just think about in your own life, at any point, if you've ever met somebody that you didn't know, but you met them, and for whatever reason they remind you of somebody else in your life, whether that's a person you like or dislike, you probably kind of felt either positive or negative about them based on who they reminded you of. And that's all transference is. All right. So that's a psychoanalytic therapy in a nutshell. And this was pretty revolutionary because nobody had really done anything like this. And so a lot of people like Freud's approach to treatment. It's still around. There's still people who are psychoanalysts to this day. But there was also a lot of backlash. There was a lot of critics of this form of therapy, especially people who thought that Freud took too much of a leading role in his type of treatment, that psychoanalysts take too much of a leading role where, for instance, they're going to tell you what your dreams mean. They're going to tell you what the problem is. They're going to focus the direction of therapy. And so a lot of people didn't think that this is the best approach. And this is kind of where client-centered therapy came from. And this was Carl Rogers was really instrumental in this, and he was one of the humanistic psychologists. And so he said, you know what, the therapist shouldn't be the person that takes the leading role. Instead, therapy should be client centered. That the client should direct the focus of therapy. The client is an expert on their own life, and the client should really be telling us what's going on in their life and what they think. Um, so this is an approach that a lot more people like. A lot of more people take this kind of approach to where we're going to let the client dictate what therapy is. We're going to involve the client in creating the goals for therapy. It's all stuff that Freud didn't really do because Freud thought he was the expert and he's going to basically tell his patients what's wrong with them. Carl Rogers said, "Now you know what? The client's the expert, and we're just going to guide the client to figuring out their issues on their own." Now, Rogers also came up with some techniques for his client-centered approach, and those three are genuineness, unconditional positive regard, and empathic understanding. Genuineness, Rogers thought of as probably one of the most important aspects of therapy, and that just meant that um, the therapists had to be genuine with their clients, that had to show their emotions. They had to share with their clients exactly what they thought and what they felt. So the therapist's internal and external experiences are one and the same. So if the therapist was sad, they were going to show that they were sad. It's not uncommon for these therapists to cry. If they were happy, they would laugh. If they thought something the client said was funny, they would laugh. They would smile. They would really share what they felt and what they thought with their clients, and that's what it meant to be genuine. So being real with the client and the patient. Unconditional positive regard. So Rogers believed that for people to grow and fulfill their potential, that it was important that they were valued as themselves. And that's all unconditional positive regard was, is that regardless of what this person is talking about, regardless of what this person might have done in their past history, the therapist should have a deep and genuine caring for this individual. That they, regardless of, they could have done the most horrible thing. They could have been a child molester, a murderer. Um, but Rogers said we should respect this person as a human being, and because they're a human being, we need to respect them and we should accept them as they are. The last one being empathy. Empathy or empathic understanding is the ability to understand what the client is feeling. It's kind of being able to put yourself in that person's shoes, to kind of see where they're coming from, to understand why this person feels the way they do, to understand why this person did what they said they did. That's all empathic understanding is. And so these are three techniques that are very important to client-centered therapy, and they're completely different from what psychoanalysis would use. Now, one more form of therapy that's pretty big, that's completely different, that took an entirely different approach, or came out of the behavioral perspective. Behavioral therapy really focuses on directly changing behavioral patterns. They also take this notion that all behaviors are learned, and the reason why this is or was so radical was because they really rejected everything that psychoanalysis and even the humanistic and client-centered approach was doing. So they were focused on direct observable behavior. They didn't really care. They didn't care about sitting down and talking to the individual. They didn't want to know why they thought they did this. They for sure didn't care about what the childhood experiences might have been like and all that. So what they focused on was, let's observe the problematic behavior. Let's get a baseline for that behavior. And then once we know how to measure it, we can change it somehow. And so behavioral therapy is all about changing behavior. It's nothing to do with the cognitive side of it. They really ignore a lot of that. They don't care why people do things or what they think about when they're doing things. They just want to try to change that behavior. So it's almost a, you can kind of think of this as like, for instance, like dog training. Remember when we are talking about in class about the reinforcement and punishment, and that's what behavioral therapy is all about. Is they're gonna change your behavior or a person's behavior by rewarding and punishing certain behaviors. Now, this is used pretty successfully to treat phobias. It's also used pretty successfully in with individuals with real severe mental disorders such as schizophrenia. Also very popular in autism spectrum disorders, and effectively changing behaviors of individuals with autism spectrum disorders. So behavioral therapy around pretty popular, and again, they're not really. It's not a therapeutic. It's not therapeutic in the sense that there's not a lot of talking going on. It's not like talk therapy. It's a lot more behavior and then rewarding and punishing certain behaviors to try to kind of shape that. Another form of therapy that's really good in treating specific phobias is something called systematic desensitization and exposure therapies. And what this is, it's a gradual and repeated reliving of a frightening experience under controlled conditions which help overcome fear of an object or situation. So gradual and repeated is really the big thing as far as systematic desensitization and exposure therapy goes. So if you had, for example, somebody who was arachnophobic, so somebody who had a irrational fear of spiders, this would be a perfect form of therapy to use, where you would gradually allow this person to face those fears and then deal with that anxiety. So, for example, if you had somebody who was arachnophobic, you would get them into the room, and maybe the first time you would just show them a picture of a spider. You would show them a picture of a spider, and they would just kind of sit there with that anxiety, deal with it until you got to a point where they no longer had anxiety over looking at a picture of a spider. Then you take the next step, and maybe that would be show them a video of a spider moving around. Again, you let them sit there with that anxiety, walk them through it until they got to a point where they no longer felt anxiety while they were watching those videos. Then you might get them to you get them a toy spider, and they can hold that and kind of manipulate that, and again get them to a point where they're no longer anxious. And maybe you get a cup, and you have a spider in there, and they can just kind of hold that and look through it and see the spider in there, deal with that anxiety, all the way to the point where you get them to really just be in a room with a spider, or they might even have a spider crawling on their arm, and they're not feeling that phobia, not feeling that anxiety. So that's what systematic desensitization and exposure therapy is. It's you're desensitizing them to whatever the thing is that they're fearing by exposing them to that actual fear. Now, this next form of treatment is called eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or simply just EMDR. This form of treatment is used with people who have traumatic memories, especially people who suffer from post traumatic stress disorder. And it's a weird form of treatment because nobody really knows why it works or how it works. And what it is, it's this bar, it's a light bar, so it's a bar of lights, where the light just moves back and forth from one side to the other. So kind of similar to if you were think about like hypnotizing somebody, and you just move your finger back and forth in front of their face, and you tell them to follow your finger with their eyes. This is kind of similar to that, in that there's this light bar, this light beam kind of moves back and forth, and people are asked to follow that with their eyes. So left to right, back and forth. And while they're doing that, following that little light, moving back and forth, they have to repeat the story of their traumatic event. So, whatever that traumatic event or experience is, they just repeat that story while they're following this light. And for whatever reason, nobody's really sure why, after a couple of these sessions, some people have been cured of their post-traumatic stress disorder. So they've been cured of their trauma, their traumatic memories, basically. And again, nobody really knows why this happens. There's no scientific research that backs any of this. There's no scientific research that explains why this is happening. But some people have been known to be cured of their post-traumatic stress simply by doing this EMDR. The next form of therapy is probably one of my favorite. This is called aversive conditioning. And aversive conditioning involves repeatedly pairing an aversive stimulus with the occurrence of undesirable behaviors or thoughts. So, aversive conditioning, and I don't know how many people have ever heard of this, or you might have even experienced this, but some people's parents. So what'll happen is, if parents catch their children smoking or drinking alcohol for the very first time, some parents will do this where if they catch a kid smoking, they force them to smoke an entire pack at once. Or if they catch their children drinking, they'll force them to drink an entire bottle of that alcohol at once, in the hopes that this kid will get sick, and then will remember how bad they felt or terrible they felt, and they'll never touch cigarettes or never touch alcohol again. And that's kind of the same principle behind aversive conditioning, is that you're pairing some kind of an aversive stimulus. So if a person's trying to quit smoking, force them to smoke a bunch of cigarettes at once, they're going to get violently sick, they're going to feel very, very nauseous, and hopefully they feel so sick that they'll never touch a cigarette again. Another form or technique, and this is operant conditioning, so these are all pretty much behavioral techniques, is something called a token economy. Token economy, most of you guys have probably been familiar or been part of, and you maybe don't even know that you were part of this. Token economy is where you're basically strengthening desired behavior through positive reinforcement. You're giving something to reinforce desired behaviors. This is quite often used in schools, where teachers will, like kids being quiet, doing their work, doing well, participating great, And so a teacher will give that child a ticket, for instance, or like a token or a coin or a star. And eventually the kid has enough of that that they can kind of turn those tokens or those tickets into a prize where they get to go choose something out of a box. That's a token economy. And so that serves two purposes. One, it strengthens the behavior in that child, but it also hopefully rubs off on everybody else, where all the other kids in that classroom are going to say, hey, I want to be able to pick a prize, so I need tickets, and I'm going to do what that kid did that got a ticket. So they were quiet, they were doing their work. I'm going to be quiet and do my work so I can get these tickets as well. So that's what a token economy would be. Now these next couple of slides are going to deal with cognitive therapies, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on these. I'm just going to run through the highlights, let you know what you need to know for the exam, and then we'll move on from the cognitive therapy. So the first one is rational emotive behavior therapy, or REBT. You do need to know for the exam that this was founded and created by Albert Ellis, and the key premise of REBT is that people's issues or their difficulties come from their faulty expectations and their irrational beliefs. So he also came up with something called an ABC model, where A stands for activating event, B stands for beliefs, and then C stands for cause emotional consequences. So what this is you have an activating event, something that happens. And depending on the person's beliefs, whether those are positive or negative about that event, those beliefs are going to cause some emotional consequences. So, for example, you might have a situation where a student does poorly on an exam. So they fail an exam, and for whatever reason, they just didn't do well on it. Then they might have some beliefs about that event. So they could be positive. It could just be, well, maybe I didn't put in enough effort. I need to study more next time and I'll do better. That's a very positive belief about that event. Others might have a very negative or an irrational belief about that event and say, well, it's because I'm dumb or it's because I'm stupid. If that student believes that they're stupid or they're dumb, that's going to cause them some emotional consequences. It might be that they might start feeling a little bit depressed. Well, I'm stupid. I'm always going to be dumb. I'm always going to fail. There's nothing I can do to change that. And so that's going to cause them some negative emotional consequences. And that's really what the ABC model is. And that's what REBT is all about. It's pointing out those irrational beliefs to people so that they don't have those negative emotional consequences that come along with it. Another form of cognitive therapy is called just cognitive therapy. And for the exam, you do need to know that Aaron Beck is the one who came up with cognitive therapy. Um, Cognitive therapy, very similarly, he also believed that there's distorted thinking, automatic negative thoughts, and these automatic negative thoughts cause psychological problems. And so the steps for this kind of therapy is helping individuals identify their automatic negative thoughts, forcing them to test the accuracy of those assumptions, and then evaluate the accuracy of that assumption. So, for instance, let's take the same individual, let's say the same student that believes that they're stupid or they're dumb. That's their automatic belief, automatic thought that pops into their head anytime they fail or don't do well in school. They're going to go back to that automatic thought that, oh, it's because I'm stupid. They're going to force the student to test that accuracy. So they're going to make the student look for situations where this is not true. So if somebody believes that they're stupid and they're just always going to fail academically, they're going to force them to find a subject that they're actually good in. And most students are. Most students are good at something. Even if they're not great at, like, let's say, math or science, there's still going to be subjects where they are good and they are doing well in. So they're going to point those out and say, well, how come if you're so stupid, how come you're doing well in this class? And so students have to kind of, or that person's going to have to be forced to look at that, and then they're going to have to rationalize, oh, okay, so maybe I'm good in this class because I like that subject. I'm good in this class because I actually try and whatnot. And so they'll see that discrepancy in their thinking that no, it's not. You're not stupid. Maybe you're just not trying hard enough in these other subjects. And then the last one, as far as cognitive therapy goes is something called CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, and this kind of this is a marriage between cognitive and the behavioral approach. So they integrate cognitive and behavioral techniques to try to solve people's issues. And this is based on the assumption that your thoughts, mood, and your behavior, they're all interrelated, that they all kind of affect each other. That your thoughts, the way that you think, that can affect how you feel. So if you're somebody who constantly thinks very negatively, you're probably going to feel pretty negatively, and then your behavior is also going to be pretty negative. Whereas if you're somebody who is a very positive thinker, your mood is generally going to be fairly positive, and then your behaviors are also going to be fairly positive. And that there's a big loop. It's like a feedback loop, that your thoughts affect your moods, which affect your behavior, and then based on those behaviors and the consequences of those behaviors, that's going to reinforce your thoughts or affect your thoughts, and then it's just this vicious cycle that goes on. So with cognitive behavioral therapy, it's let's change the way that you think, because that'll change the way you feel, how you feel, and then that'll change the behaviors that we see. All right. Moving on, we're going to get into some different forms of group therapy now, or some of the other forms of therapy. Group therapy is a form of therapy that involves a group, so more than one person. Generally, group therapy goes between 8 and 12 people. It's usually 8 is like that, kind of looked at as that perfect number. You wouldn't want a group with more than 12 people. And what this is, it's a group of people who are generally suffering with the same issue. So there's group therapies for like addiction, it might be depression, it might whatever issue you can think of. There's probably a specific group out there where everybody in the group is kind of dealing with that same issue. Some of the advantages of group therapy are that they're very cost effective, so they're very cheap. So rather than spending $150 to see a therapist, you can maybe spend 20 bucks and be part of a group. You get to interact with other people. There's a lot. It builds up this kind of social support system. The really great thing about group therapy is that you're dealing with individuals that are all over, as far as where they are in their time period with struggling with this issue. So you have some people who are fairly new. They're just now beginning to struggle with this issue, or just now starting the treatment process. Then you have other people who are kind of further along the way. They might be halfway in their struggle, and so they can kind of talk about some of the differences, some of the positives that have happened, some of the negatives, some of the challenges. And then you also have people who are towards the end of this treatment cycle, and so they're getting ready to be discharged. And those are the people that can really attest, like, hey, I was there. We were all at that point where you're at, where we all had to start with this. I'm now at the end. This really works. So it does give some people some hopes. Um, and people can bounce things off of each other, so they can say, like, this worked for me. Why don't you go ahead and give that a try? Or this didn't really work for me. Maybe stay away from that. So those are some of the advantages. There are some disadvantages to group therapy, in the sense that the clinician or the therapist doesn't just get to focus in on one individual. It's a group, so everybody has gets time to speak, and so it's not as individualized as having just an individual therapist might be. The other more concerning thing with group therapy is often confidentiality, because even though the clinician has to be confidential and has to protect your confidentiality and privacy, the other group members don't really have to do that, and there's no way to control that. So you can't really control what everybody else in the group goes out and says afterwards. So that those are some of the disadvantages. Another form of group therapy are self-help groups. And so self-help groups are things like Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, Al-Anon. The only real difference between self-help groups and group therapy is that they're not ran by a licensed professional. So group therapies are generally ran by a licensed professional. These self-help groups like AA, NA, and Al-Anon, they're not ran by a licensed professional. And that's pretty much the only difference. They've been shown to be just as effective as actually having a therapist or a licensed professional ran group. But that's all you need to know, is that the main difference between self-help groups and Um, Group therapy is that they're not ran by a licensed professional. All right. Family therapy, we're not going to spend a lot of time on. You can just look at the definition and read the definition here. It's family therapists view the family as a system. So it's an interdependent unit and a dynamic structure in which each member plays a unique role. So with family therapy, rather than treating everybody as an individual, they treat the family as a unit. And if one person, it's almost like a machine, and if one part is messing up, the entire family becomes dysfunctional. And so everybody plays a unique role. There's never just going to be one person, even though a lot of times families like to just blame one person for all the issues, like that's that black sheep. A family therapist says, no, that's not true. It's not just one person that's the problem. Everybody, you guys are a unit. Everybody shares some responsibility in this person's behavior or in the dysfunction that's happening in that family. Another form of therapy is couples therapy. And again, this is fairly self explanatory. This is relationship therapy that helps with difficulties in marriage or other committed relationships. So, couples therapy, a lot of times people believe that couples therapy is not effective because only about 40 it depends on the statistics, but it's almost half of the people that go into couples therapy still end up breaking up or dissolving that relationship. The issue with those statistics are that a lot of people go into couples therapy as a last ditch effort when it's already too late, where they're at a point where they're saying, all right, we'll give this a shot, and if this doesn't work, then at that point it's usually too late to save a relationship anyway. Now, there's one question on the study guide that asks how effective therapy is, and for all intents and purposes, the answer is just psychotherapy is significantly more effective than no treatment. So that's the answer. It's more effective than not having any treatment. That's all you really need for that question. Moving on, we're going to get into the biomedical therapy. So there's two slides left. Psychotropic medications. Wish we could have done this in class because it's a topic that I really enjoy. But all you need to know is psychotropic medication is any medication capable of affecting the mind, emotions, and behavior. So any medication that you take that affects something in your mind, changes your emotions, or your behavior is going to fall under this psychotropic medication. And this is fairly controversial subject in psychology because it's so inconsistent. So you do have some people who go in with a mental disorder or some psychological disorder. They get on a medication and they're very lucky that first medication they get and dosage is the correct one and they're good. However, on one end of the spectrum, you also have people where this becomes it can be a lifelong process. Like some people, it takes years just to figure out the right medication and dosage. So a person goes in and they get a medication. Now you have to wait about a month just to see whether or not the medication is effective or even if it's working. And if it's not, then they change the dosage. Now you wait another month, see if it kicks in. If it doesn't, change the dosage again. Wait another month. Then if it doesn't, they might take you off that medication completely and put you on a different medication. Now again, you're waiting a month. So this is how very easy for some people to go a couple of years just trying to figure out what the right medication is. And then on the other hand, on the other side of the spectrum, you have people where medication just never works. It doesn't matter what the medication, what the dosage is, it does not work for them. So, for example, you have people with clinical depression where nothing works. Therapy doesn't work and medication doesn't work. And in those cases, there's a last ditch effort, and that's called electroconvulsive therapy. And so this is still something that's used today that involves a shock. So you're basically shocking the brain and creates a seizure. And the theory is it's like shorting out a computer. So that it kind of just resets everything. And so all the hormones and everything else in the brain gets reset when it's shocked. And so then the depression should go away as well. And it's pretty effective. So most people who get this, yeah, their depression does go away, but it's fairly temporary. So a lot of times, I think statistically speaking, talking about for most people after about 6 months their depression comes back, but the hope is that in those 6 months you can do enough work to kind of teach this person new coping mechanisms, get them on medication that might work, that can stabilize their mood a little bit. So you have that 6 month window of like trying to do some work, and then depression comes back, then they have to get shocked again. You get another 6 months to kind of work with. Now, this is fairly controversial because of some of the cognitive side effects where people have come out of doing electroconvulsive therapy and they've lost certain memories. Some people have claimed that their personalities have completely changed, where other family members saying, "Well, this he or she they're completely different people now." So it is fairly controversial, but just do know that electroconvulsive therapy is still being used today. And that's pretty much it. So now you have all of the information you need for the next exam. So the next exam is going to cover chapters 13 and 14. So that's all the disorders and all the treatments. Match up all the information on the study guide. If you have any questions, shoot me an email and I'll point you in the right direction.